Section 16. How long had Dr. Holmes been attending him? 6 weeks. Prescribed a little bromide. Said there was nothing the matter. Ah, yes. Those general practitioners, thought Sir William. It took half his time to undo their blunders. Some were irreparable. You served with great distinction in the war? The patient repeated the word, war, interrogatively. He was attaching meanings to words of a symbolical kind, a serious symptom to be noted on the card. The war? The patient asked. The European war, that little shindy of schoolboys with gunpowder. Had he served with distinction? He really forgot. In the war itself he had failed. Yes, he served with the greatest distinction, Risha assured the doctor. He was promoted. And they have the very highest opinion of you at your office, Sir William murmured, glancing at Mr. Brewer's very generously worded letter. So that you have nothing to worry you, no financial anxiety, nothing. He had committed an appalling crime and been condemned to death by human nature. I have, he began, committed a crime. He has done nothing wrong whatever, Risha assured the doctor. If Mr. Smith would wait, said Sir William, he would speak to Mrs. Smith in the next room. Her husband was very seriously ill, Sir William said. Did he threaten to kill himself? Oh, he did, she cried. But he did not mean it, she said. Of course not. It was merely a question of rest, said Sir William. Of rest. A long rest in bed. There was a delightful home down in the country where her husband would be perfectly looked after. Away from her, she asked. Unfortunately, yes. The people we care for most are not good for us when we are ill. But he was not mad, was he? Sir William said he never spoke of madness. He called it not having a sense of proportion. But her husband did not like doctors. He would refuse to go there. Shortly and kindly, Sir William explained to her the state of the case. He had threatened to kill himself. There was no alternative. It was a question of law. He would lie in bed in a beautiful house in the country. The nurses were admirable. Sir William would visit him once a week. If Mrs. Warren Smith was quite sure she had no more questions to ask, he never hurried his patients. They would return to her husband. She had nothing more to ask, not of Sir William. So they returned to the most exalted of mankind, the criminal who faced his judges, the victim exposed on the heights, the fugitive, the drowned sailor, the poet of the immortal ode, the lord who had gone from life to death, to Septimus Warren Smith, who sat in the armchair under the skylight, staring at a photograph of Lady Bradshaw in court dress, muttering messages about beauty. "We have had our little talk," said Sir William. "He says you are very, very ill," Risha cried. "We have been arranging that you should go into a home," said Sir William. "One of Holmes's homes," sneered Septimus. The fellow made a distasteful impression, for there was in Sir William, whose father had been a tradesman, a natural respect for breeding and clothing, which shabbiness nettled. Again, more profoundly, there was in Sir William, who had never had time for reading, a grudge, deeply buried, against cultivated people who came into his room and intimated that doctors, whose profession is a constant strain upon all the highest faculties, are not educated men. "One of my homes, Mr. Warren Smith," he said, "where we will teach you to rest." And there was just one thing more. He was quite certain that when Mr. Warren Smith was well, he was the last man in the world to frighten his wife. But he had talked of killing himself. "We all have our moments of depression," said Sir William. "Once you fall," Septimus repeated to himself, "human nature is on you. Holmes and Bradshaw are on you. They scour the desert. They fly screaming into the wilderness. The rack and the thumbscrew are applied. Human nature is remorseless." "Impulses came upon him sometimes?" Sir William asked with his pencil on a pink card. "That was his own affair," said Septimus. "Nobody lives for himself alone," said Sir William, glancing at the photograph of his wife in court dress. "And you have a brilliant career before you," said Sir William. There was Mr. Brewer's letter on the table. "An exceptionally brilliant career." But if he confessed? If he communicated? Would they let him off then, his torturers? I he stammered. But what was his crime? He could not remember it. Yes, Sir William encouraged him, but it was growing late. Love, trees, there is no crime. What was his message? He could not remember it. Septimus stammered. Try to think as little about yourself as possible, said Sir William kindly. Really, he was not fit to be about. Was there anything else they wished to ask him? Sir William would make all arrangements, he murmured to Risha, and he would let her know between 5 and 6 that evening, he murmured. Trust everything to me, he said, and dismissed them. Never, never had Risha felt such agony in her life. She had asked for help and been deserted. He had failed them. Sir William Bradshaw was not a nice man. The upkeep of that motor car alone must cost him quite a lot, said Septimus when they got out into the street. She clung to his arm. They had been deserted. But what more did she want? To his patients he gave 3/4 of an hour, and if in this exacting science, which has to do with what, after all, we know nothing about, the nervous system, the human brain, a doctor loses his sense of proportion, as a doctor he fails. Health we must have, and health is proportion, so that when a man comes into your room and says he is Christ, a common delusion, and has a message, as they mostly have, and threatens, as they often do, to kill himself, you invoke proportion. Order rest in bed, rest in solitude, silence and rest, rest without friends, without books, without messages, 6 months' rest, until a man who went in weighing 7 stone 6 comes out weighing 12. Proportion, divine proportion, Sir William's goddess, was acquired by Sir William walking hospitals, catching salmon, begetting one son in Harley Street by Lady Bradshaw, who caught salmon herself and took photographs scarcely to be distinguished from the work of professionals. Worshipping proportion, Sir William not only prospered himself, but made England prosper. Secluded her lunatics, forbade childbirth, penalised despair, made it impossible for the unfit to propagate their views, until they, too, shared his sense of proportion. His, if they were men, Lady Bradshaw's, if they were women. She embroidered, knitted, spent 4 nights out of 7 at home with her son, so that not only did his colleagues respect him, his subordinates fear him, but the friends and relations of his patients felt for him the keenest gratitude for insisting that these prophetic Christs and Christesses, who prophesied the end of the world, or the advent of God, should drink milk in bed, as Sir William ordered. Sir William, with his 30 years' experience of these kinds of cases, and his infallible instinct. This is madness, this sense. In fact, his sense of proportion. But proportion has a sister, less smiling, more formidable, a goddess even now engaged in the heat and sands of India, the mud and swamp of Africa, the purlieus of London, wherever, in short, the climate or the devil tempts men to fall from the true belief which is her own, is even now engaged in dashing down shrines, smashing idols, and setting up in their place her own stern countenance. Conversion is her name, and she feasts on the wills of the weakly, loving to impress, to impose, adoring her own features stamped on the face of the populace. At Hyde Park Corner on a tub she stands preaching, shrouds herself in white and walks penitentially disguised as brotherly love through factories and parliaments, offers help but desires power. Smites out of her way roughly the dissentient, the dissatisfied, bestows her blessing on those who, looking upward, catch submissively from her eyes the light of their own. This lady, too, Risha Warren Smith divined it, had her dwelling in Sir William's heart, though concealed, as she mostly is, under some plausible disguise, some venerable name, love, duty, self-sacrifice. How he would work, how toil to raise funds, propagate reforms, initiate institutions. But conversion, fastidious goddess, loves blood better than brick, and feasts most subtly on the human will. For example, Lady Bradshaw. 15 years ago she had gone under. It was nothing you could put your finger on. There had been no scene, no snap, only the slow sinking, waterlogged of her will into his. Sweet was her smile, swift her submission. Dinner in Harley Street, numbering 8 or 9 courses, feeding 10 or 15 guests of the professional classes, was smooth and urbane. Only as the evening wore on, a very slight dullness, or uneasiness perhaps, a nervous twitch, fumble, stumble and confusion indicated what it was really painful to believe, that the poor lady lied. Once, long ago, she had caught salmon freely, now, quick to minister to the craving which lit her husband's eye so oilily for dominion, for power, she cramped, squeezed, pared, pruned, drew back, peeped through, so that without knowing precisely what made the evening disagreeable and caused this pressure on the top of the head, which might well be imputed to the professional conversation, or the fatigue of a great doctor whose life, Lady Bradshaw said, is not his own but his patient's. Disagreeable it was, so that guests, when the clock struck 10, breathed in the air of Harley Street, even with rapture, which relief, however, was denied to his patients. There, in the grey room with the pictures on the wall and the valuable furniture, under the ground-glass skylight, they learnt the extent of their transgressions. Huddled up in armchairs, they watched him go through, for their benefit, a curious exercise with the arms, which he shot out, brought sharply back to his hip, to prove, if the patient was obstinate, that Sir William was master of his own actions, which the patient was not. There some weakly broke down, sobbed, submitted. Others, inspired by heaven knows what intemperate madness, called Sir William to his face a damnable humbug, questioned even more impiously life itself. Why live, they demanded. Sir William replied that life was good. Certainly Lady Bradshaw in ostrich feathers hung over the mantelpiece, and as for his income it was quite 12,000 a year. But to us, they protested, life has given no such bounty. He acquiesced. They lacked a sense of proportion. And perhaps, after all, there is no God. He shrugged his shoulders. In short, this living or not living is an affair of our own. But there they were mistaken. Sir William had a friend in Surrey where they taught what Sir William frankly admitted was a difficult art, a sense of proportion. There were, moreover, family affection, honour, courage, and a brilliant career. All of these had in Sir William a resolute champion. If they failed him, he had to support police and the good of society, which, he remarked very quietly, would take care, down in Surrey, that these unsocial impulses, bred more than anything by the lack of good blood, were held in control. And then stole out from her hiding-place and mounted her throne that goddess whose lust is to override opposition, to stamp indelibly in the sanctuaries of others the image of herself. Naked, defenceless, the exhausted, the friendless received the impress of Sir William's will. He swooped, he devoured, he shut people up. It was this combination of decision and humanity that endeared Sir William so greatly to the relations of his victims. Section 17. But Risha Warren-Smith cried, walking down Harley Street, that she did not like that man. Shredding and slicing, dividing and subdividing, the clocks of Harley Street nibbled at the June day, counselled submission, upheld authority, and pointed out in chorus the supreme advantages of a sense of proportion, until the mound of time was so far diminished that a commercial clock, suspended above a shop in Oxford Street, announced, genially and fraternally, as if it were a pleasure to Messrs. Rigby and Lowndes to give the information gratis, that it was 1:30. Looking up, it appeared that each letter of their names stood for one of the hours. Subconsciously, one was grateful to Rigby and Lowndes for giving one time ratified by Greenwich, and this gratitude, so Hugh Whitbread ruminated, dallying there in front of the shop window, naturally took the form later of buying off Rigby and Lowndes' socks or shoes. So he ruminated. It was his habit. He did not go deeply. He brushed surfaces, the dead languages, the living, life in Constantinople, Paris, Rome, riding, shooting, tennis it had been once. The malicious asserted that he now kept guard at Buckingham Palace, dressed in silk stockings and knee breeches, over what nobody knew. But he did it extremely efficiently. He had been afloat on the cream of English society for 55 years. He had known prime ministers. His affections were understood to be deep. And if it were true that he had not taken part in any of the great movements of the time, or held important office, 1 or 2 humble reforms stood to his credit. An improvement in public shelters was one, the protection of owls in Norfolk another. Servant girls had reason to be grateful to him, and his name at the end of letters to the Times, asking for funds, appealing to the public to protect, to preserve, to clear up litter, to abate smoke, and stamp out immorality in parks, commanded respect. A magnificent figure he cut, too, pausing for a moment, as the sound of the half-hour died away, to look critically, magisterially, at socks and shoes, impeccable, substantial, as if he beheld the world from a certain eminence and dressed to match, but realised the obligations which size, wealth, health entail, and observed punctiliously, even when not absolutely necessary, little courtesies, old-fashioned ceremonies which gave a quality to his manner, something to imitate, something to remember him by. For he would never lunch, for example, with Lady Bruton, whom he had known these 20 years, without bringing her in his outstretched hand a bunch of carnations and asking Miss Brush, Lady Bruton's secretary, after her brother in South Africa, which, for some reason, Miss Brush, deficient though she was in every attribute of female charm, so much resented that she said, "Thank you, he's doing very well in South Africa," when for 6 years he had been doing badly in Portsmouth. Lady Bruton herself preferred Richard Dalloway, who arrived at the next moment. Indeed, they met on the doorstep. Lady Bruton preferred Richard Dalloway, of course. He was made of much finer material, but she wouldn't let them run down her poor dear Hugh. She could never forget his kindness. He had been really remarkably kind. She forgot precisely upon what occasion, but he had been remarkably kind. Anyhow, the difference between one man and another does not amount to much. She had never seen the sense of cutting people up, as Clarissa Dalloway did, cutting them up and sticking them together again, not at any rate when one was 62. She took Hugh's carnations with her angular grim smile. There was nobody else coming, she said. She had got them there on false pretences, to help her out of a difficulty. "But let us eat first," she said. And so there began a soundless and exquisite passing to and fro through swing doors of aproned, white-capped maids, handmaidens not of necessity, but adepts in a mystery or grand deception practised by hostesses in Mayfair, from 1:30 to 2. When, with a wave of the hand, the traffic ceases, and there rises instead this profound illusion, in the first place about the food, how it is not paid for, and then that the table spreads itself voluntarily with glass and silver, little mats, saucers of red fruit, films of brown cream masked turbot, in casseroles severed chickens swim, coloured, undomestic the fire burns, and with the wine and the coffee, not paid for, rise jocund visions before musing eyes, gently speculative eyes, eyes to whom life appears musical, mysterious, eyes now kindled to observe genially the beauty of the red carnations which Lady Bruton, whose movements were always angular, had laid beside her plate, so that Hugh Whitbread, feeling at peace with the entire universe and at the same time completely sure of his standing, said, resting his fork, "Wouldn't they look charming against your lace?" Miss Brush resented this familiarity intensely. She thought him an underbred fellow. She made Lady Bruton laugh. Lady Bruton raised the carnations, holding them rather stiffly with much the same attitude with which the General held the scroll in the picture behind her. She remained fixed, tranced. Which was she now? The General's great-granddaughter? Great-great-granddaughter? Richard Dalloway asked himself. Sir Roderick, Sir Miles, Sir Talbot, that was it. It was remarkable how in that family the likeness persisted in the women. She should have been a general of dragoons herself, and Richard would have served under her, cheerfully. He had the greatest respect for her. He cherished these romantic views about well-set-up old women of pedigree, and would have liked, in his good-humoured way, to bring some young hotheads of his acquaintance to lunch with her, as if a type like hers could be bred of amiable tea-drinking enthusiasts. He knew her country. He knew her people. There was a vine still bearing, which either Lovelace or Herrick, she never read a word of poetry herself, but so the story ran, had sat under. Better wait to put before them the question that bothered her, about making an appeal to the public, if so, in what terms, and so on. Better wait until they have had their coffee, Lady Bruton thought, and so laid the carnations down beside her plate. "How's Clarissa?" she asked abruptly. Clarissa always said that Lady Bruton did not like her. Indeed, Lady Bruton had the reputation of being more interested in politics than people, of talking like a man, of having had a finger in some notorious intrigue of the 80s which was now beginning to be mentioned in memoirs. Certainly there was an alcove in her drawing-room, and a table in that alcove, and a photograph upon that table of General Sir Talbot Moore, now deceased, who had written there, one evening in the 80s, in Lady Bruton's presence, with her cognizance, perhaps advice, a telegram ordering the British troops to advance upon an historical occasion. She kept the pen and told the story. Thus, when she said in her offhand way, "How's Clarissa?" husbands had difficulty in persuading their wives, and indeed, however devoted, were secretly doubtful themselves of her interest in women who often got in their husbands' way, prevented them from accepting posts abroad, and had to be taken to the seaside in the middle of the session to recover from influenza. Nevertheless, her inquiry, "How's Clarissa?" was known by women infallibly to be a signal from a well-wisher, from an almost silent companion, whose utterances, half a dozen perhaps in the course of a lifetime, signified recognition of some feminine comradeship, which went beneath masculine lunch parties and united Lady Bruton and Mrs. Dalloway, who seldom met, and appeared when they did meet indifferent and even hostile in a singular bond. "I met Clarissa in the park this morning," said Hugh Whitbread, diving into the casserole, anxious to pay himself this little tribute, for he had only to come to London, and he met everybody at once. But greedy, one of the greediest men she had ever known, Millie Brush thought, who observed men with unflinching rectitude, and was capable of everlasting devotion, to her own sex in particular, being knobbed, scraped, angular, and entirely without feminine charm. "Do you know who's in town?" said Lady Bruton, suddenly bethinking her. "Our old friend Peter Walsh." They all smiled. Peter Walsh! And Mr. Dalloway was genuinely glad, Millie Brush thought, and Mr. Whitbread thought only of his chicken. Peter Walsh! All three, Lady Bruton, Hugh Whitbread, and Richard Dalloway, remembered the same thing. How passionately Peter had been in love, been rejected, gone to India, come a cropper, made a mess of things, and Richard Dalloway had a very great liking for the dear old fellow too. Millie Brush saw that, saw a depth in the brown of his eyes, saw him hesitate, consider, which interested her, as Mr. Dalloway always interested her, for what was he thinking, she wondered, about Peter Walsh? That Peter Walsh had been in love with Clarissa, that he would go back directly after lunch and find Clarissa, that he would tell her, in so many words, that he loved her. Yes, he would say that. Millie Brush once might almost have fallen in love with these silences, and Mr. Dalloway was always so dependable, such a gentleman too. Now being 40, Lady Bruton had only to nod or turn her head a little abruptly, and Millie Brush took the signal, however deeply she might be sunk in these reflections of a detached spirit, of an uncorrupted soul whom life could not bamboozle, because life had not offered her a trinket of the slightest value, not a curl, smile, lip, cheek, nose, nothing whatever. Lady Bruton had only to nod, and Perkins was instructed to quicken the coffee. "Yes, Peter Walsh has come back," said Lady Bruton. It was vaguely flattering to them all. He had come back, battered, unsuccessful, to their secure shores. But to help him, they reflected, was impossible. There was some flaw in his character. Hugh Whitbread said one might, of course, mention his name to so-and-so. He wrinkled lugubriously, consequentially, at the thought of the letters he would write to the heads of government offices about my old friend Peter Walsh, and so on. But it wouldn't lead to anything, not to anything permanent, because of his character. "In trouble with some woman," said Lady Bruton. They had all guessed that that was at the bottom of it. "However," said Lady Bruton, anxious to leave the subject, "we shall hear the whole story from Peter himself." The coffee was very slow in coming. "The address?" murmured Hugh Whitbread, and there was at once a ripple in the grey tide of service which washed round Lady Bruton day in, day out. collecting, intercepting, enveloping her in a fine tissue which broke concussions, mitigated interruptions, and spread round the house in Brook Street a fine net where things lodged and were picked out accurately, instantly, by grey-haired Perkins, who had been with Lady Bruton these 30 years and now wrote down the address, handed it to Mr. Whitbread, who took out his pocket-book, raised his eyebrows, and slipping it in among documents of the highest importance, said that he would get Evelyn to ask him to lunch. They were waiting to bring the coffee until Mr. Whitbread had finished. Hugh was very slow, Lady Bruton thought. He was getting fat, she noticed. Richard always kept himself in the pink of condition. She was getting impatient. The whole of her being was setting positively, undeniably, domineeringly brushing aside all this unnecessary trifling. Peter Walsh and his affairs, upon that subject which engaged her attention, and not merely her attention, but that fibre which was the ramrod of her soul, that essential part of her without which Millicent Bruton would not have been Millicent Bruton, that project for emigrating young people of both sexes born of respectable parents and setting them up with a fair prospect of doing well in Canada. She exaggerated. She had perhaps lost her sense of proportion. Emigration was not to others the obvious remedy, the sublime conception. It was not to them, not to Hugh or Richard, or even to devoted Miss Brush, the liberator of the pent egotism, which a strong martial woman, well-nourished, well-descended, of direct impulses, downright feelings, and little introspective power. Broad and simple. Why could not everyone be broad and simple, she asked. Feels rise within her, once youth is past, and must eject upon some object. It may be emigration, it may be emancipation, but whatever it be, this object round which the essence of her soul is daily secreted becomes inevitably prismatic, lustrous, half looking-glass, half precious stone, now carefully hidden in case people should sneer at it, now proudly displayed. Emigration had become, in short, largely Lady Bruton. Section 18. But she had to write, and one letter to the Times, she used to say to Miss Brush, cost her more than to organise an expedition to South Africa, which she had done in the war. After a morning's battle beginning, tearing up, beginning again, she used to feel the futility of her own womanhood as she felt it on no other occasion, and would turn gratefully to the thought of Hugh Whitbread, who possessed, no one could doubt it, the art of writing letters to the Times. A being so differently constituted from herself, with such a command of language, able to put things as editors like them put, had passions which one could not call simply greed. Lady Bruton often suspended judgment upon men in deference to the mysterious accord in which they, but no woman, stood to the laws of the universe, knew how to put things, knew what was said, so that if Richard advised her, and Hugh wrote for her, she was sure of being somehow right. So she let Hugh eat his souffle, asked after poor Evelyn, waited until they were smoking, and then said, "Milly, would you fetch the papers?" And Miss Brush went out, came back, laid papers on the table, and Hugh produced his fountain pen, his silver fountain pen, which had done 20 years' service, he said, unscrewing the cap. It was still in perfect order. He had shown it to the makers. There was no reason, they said, why it should ever wear out, which was somehow to Hugh's credit, and to the credit of the sentiments which his pen expressed, so Richard Dalloway felt, as Hugh began carefully writing capital letters with rings round them in the margin, and thus marvellously reduced Lady Bruton's tangles to sense, to grammar, such as the editor of the Times, Lady Bruton felt, watching the marvellous transformation, must respect. Hugh was slow. Hugh was pertinacious. Richard said one must take risks. Hugh proposed modifications in deference to people's feelings, which, he said rather tartly when Richard laughed, had to be considered, and read out how, therefore, we are of opinion that the times are ripe, the superfluous youth of our ever-increasing population, what we owe to the dead, which Richard thought all stuffing and bunkum, but no harm in it, of course. And Hugh went on drafting sentiments in alphabetical order of the highest nobility, brushing the cigar ash from his waistcoat, and summing up now and then the progress they had made, until finally he read out the draft of a letter which Lady Bruton felt certain was a masterpiece. Could her own meaning sound like that? Hugh could not guarantee that the editor would put it in, but he would be meeting somebody at luncheon. Whereupon Lady Bruton, who seldom did a graceful thing, stuffed all Hugh's carnations into the front of her dress, and flinging her hands out, called him "My Prime Minister." What she would have done without them both she did not know. They rose, and Richard Dalloway strolled off as usual to have a look at the General's portrait, because he meant, whenever he had a moment of leisure, to write a history of Lady Bruton's family. And Millicent Bruton was very proud of her family. But they could wait, she said, looking at the picture, meaning that her family, of military men, administrators, admirals, had been men of action, who had done their duty. And Richard's first duty was to his country. But it was a fine face, she said, and all the papers were ready for Richard down at Aldmixton whenever the time came. The Labour government, she meant. "Ah, the news from India!" she cried. And then, as they stood in the hall taking yellow gloves from the bowl on the malachite table, and Hugh was offering Miss Brush with quite unnecessary courtesy some discarded ticket or other compliment, which she loathed from the depths of her heart and blushed brick red, Richard turned to Lady Bruton with his hat in his hand and said, "We shall see you at our party tonight." Whereupon Lady Bruton resumed the magnificence which letter-writing had shattered. She might come or she might not come. Clarissa had wonderful energy. Parties terrified Lady Bruton. But then she was getting old. So she intimated, standing at her doorway, handsome, very erect, while her chow stretched behind her, and Miss Brush disappeared into the background with her hands full of papers. And Lady Bruton went ponderously, majestically, up to her room, lay, one arm extended on the sofa. She sighed, she snored, not that she was asleep, only drowsy and heavy. Drowsy and heavy, like a field of clover in the sunshine this hot June day, with the bees going round and about, and the yellow butterflies. Always she went back to those fields down in Devonshire, where she had jumped the brooks on Patty, her pony, with Mortimer and Tom, her brothers. And there were the dogs, there were the rats, there were her father and mother on the lawn under the trees, with the tea-things out, and the beds of dahlias, the hollyhocks, the pampas grass, and they, little wretches, always up to some mischief, stealing back through the shrubbery so as not to be seen, all bedraggled from some roguery. What old nurse used to say about her frocks? Ah, dear, she remembered. It was Wednesday in Brook Street. Those kind good fellows, Richard Dalloway, Hugh Whitbread, had gone this hot day through the streets, whose growl came up to her lying on the sofa. Power was hers, position, income. She had lived in the forefront of her time. She had had good friends, known the ablest men of her day. Murmuring London flowed up to her, and her hand, lying on the sofa back, curled upon some imaginary baton such as her grandfather's might have held, holding which she seemed, drowsy and heavy, to be commanding battalions marching to Canada, and those good fellows walking across London, that territory of theirs, that little bit of carpet, Mayfair. And they went further and further from her, being attached to her by a thin thread, since they had lunched with her, which would stretch and stretch, get thinner and thinner as they walked across London, as if one's friends were attached to one's body after lunching with them by a thin thread which, as she dozed there, became hazy with the sound of bells, striking the hour or ringing to service, as a single spider's thread is blotted with raindrops and burdened, sags down. So she slept. And Richard Dalloway and Hugh Whitbread hesitated at the corner of Conduit Street at the very moment that Millicent Bruton, lying on the sofa, let the thread snap, snored. Contrary winds buffeted at the street corner. They looked in at a shop window. They did not wish to buy or to talk, but to part. Only with contrary winds buffeting the street corner, with some sort of lapse in the tides of the body, two forces meeting in a swirl, morning and afternoon, they paused. Some newspaper placard went up in the air, gallantly, like a kite at first, then paused, swooped, fluttered, and a lady's veil hung. Yellow awnings trembled. The speed of the morning traffic slackened, and single carts rattled carelessly down half-empty streets. In Norfolk, of which Richard Dalloway was half thinking, a soft warm wind blew back the petals, confused the waters, ruffled the flowering grasses. Haymakers who had pitched beneath hedges to sleep away the morning toil, parted curtains of green blades, moving trembling globes of cow parsley to see the sky, the blue, the steadfast, the blazing summer sky. Aware that he was looking at a silver two-handled Jacobean mug, and that Hugh Whitbread admired condescendingly with airs of connoisseurship a Spanish necklace which he thought of asking the price of in case Evelyn might like it. Still Richard was torpid, could not think or move. Life had thrown up this wreckage, shop windows full of coloured paste, and one stood stark with the lethargy of the old, stiff with the rigidity of the old, looking in. Evelyn Whitbread might like to buy this Spanish necklace, so she might. Yawn he must. Hugh was going into the shop. "Right you are," said Richard, following. Goodness knows he didn't want to go buying necklaces with Hugh, but there are tides in the body. Morning meets afternoon. Born like a frail shallop on deep, deep floods, Lady Bruton's great-grandfather and his memoir and his campaigns in North America were whelmed and sunk. And Millicent Bruton, too, she went under. Richard didn't care a straw what became of emigration, about that letter, whether the editor put it in or not. The necklace hung stretched between Hugh's admirable fingers. Let him give it to a girl, if he must buy jewels. Any girl in the street. For the worthlessness of this life did strike Richard pretty forcibly, buying necklaces for Evelyn. If he'd had a boy, he'd have said, work, work. But he had his Elizabeth. He adored his Elizabeth. "I should like to see Mr. Dubonnet," said Hugh in his curt, worldly way. It appeared that this Dubonnet had the measurements of Mrs. Whitbread's neck, or, more strangely still, knew her views upon Spanish jewellery and the extent of her possessions in that line, which Hugh could not remember. All of which seemed to Richard Dalloway awfully odd, for he never gave Clarissa presents, except a bracelet 2 or 3 years ago, which had not been a success. She never wore it. It pained him to remember that she never wore it. And as a single spider's thread, after wavering here and there, attaches itself to the point of a leaf, so Richard's mind, recovering from its lethargy, set now on his wife, Clarissa, whom Peter Walsh had loved so passionately, and Richard had had a sudden vision of her there at luncheon, of himself and Clarissa, of their life together, and he drew the tray of old jewels towards him, and taking up first this brooch, then that ring. "How much is that?" he asked, but doubted his own taste. He wanted to open the drawing-room door and come in holding out something, a present for Clarissa. Only what? But Hugh was on his legs again. He was unspeakably pompous. Really, after dealing here for 35 years, he was not going to be put off by a mere boy who did not know his business. For Dubonnet, it seemed, was out, and Hugh would not buy anything until Mr. Dubonnet chose to be in, at which the youth flushed and bowed his correct little bow. It was all perfectly correct. And yet Richard couldn't have said that to save his life. Why these people stood that damned insolence he could not conceive. Hugh was becoming an intolerable ass. Richard Dalloway could not stand more than an hour of his society, and flicking his bowler hat by way of farewell, Richard turned at the corner of Conduit Street, eager, yes, very eager, to travel that spider's thread of attachment between himself and Clarissa. He would go straight to her, in Westminster. But he wanted to come in holding something. Flowers? Yes, flowers, since he did not trust his taste in gold. Any number of flowers, roses, orchids, to celebrate what was, reckoning things as you will, an event. This feeling about her when they spoke of Peter Walsh at luncheon, and they never spoke of it, not for years had they spoken of it, which, he thought, grasping his red and white roses together, a vast bunch in tissue paper, is the greatest mistake in the world. The time comes when it can't be said. One's too shy to say it, he thought, pocketing his 6pence or 2 of change, setting off with his great bunch held against his body to Westminster, to say straight out in so many words, whatever she might think of him, holding out his flowers, "I love you." Why not? Really, it was a miracle, thinking of the war, and thousands of poor chaps, with all their lives before them, shovelled together, already half forgotten. It was a miracle. Here he was walking across London to say to Clarissa in so many words that he loved her, which one never does say, he thought. Partly one's lazy, partly one's shy. And Clarissa, it was difficult to think of her, except in starts, as at luncheon, when he saw her quite distinctly. Their whole life. He stopped at the crossing and repeated, being simple by nature and undebauched, because he had tramped and shot, being pertinacious and dogged, having championed the downtrodden and followed his instincts in the House of Commons, being preserved in his simplicity, yet at the same time grown rather speechless, rather stiff. He repeated that it was a miracle that he should have married Clarissa, a miracle. His life had been a miracle, he thought, hesitating to cross. But it did make his blood boil to see little creatures of 5 or 6 crossing Piccadilly alone. The police ought to have stopped the traffic at once. He had no illusions about the London police. Indeed, he was collecting evidence of their malpractices, and those costermongers not allowed to stand their barrows in the streets, and prostitutes. Good Lord, the fault wasn't in them, nor in young men either, but in our detestable social system, and so forth. All of which he considered, could be seen considering, grey, dogged, dapper, clean, as he walked across the park to tell his wife that he loved her.